everyone. My name is Erica George. I'm the Samuel D. Thurman Professor of Law at the S.J. Quinney College of Law, and I have the honor of directing the Tanner Humanities Center. It is my particular pleasure to introduce the last but not least of our speakers, Katharina Gerstenberger. But before I do that, I wanted to acknowledge this class and cohort of fellows and the people who made it possible. I thank our deans, Stuart Culver, who I understand is in the room. And I also thank Unseen Heroes, the Faculty Advisory Board. This class of fellows was selected by, in part, our chair of the Faculty Advisory Board and also my faculty director, Associate Director for Faculty, Jeremy Rosen, as well as Robin Jensen, Jeff McCarthy, Colleen O'Neill, Matthew Wickman, Matthew Rosen. So thank you for that. Also, this class of fellows was the largest we've ever had and also the most diverse that we've ever had. And also Paul Reeve, I was remiss in his contribution to selections as well. And I just wanted to tell you a little bit about this group. They've been extraordinary. We've had 12 fellows. We've had our largest and most diverse group of fellows. We have disciplines represented from across the College of Humanities and across the campus with the College of Cultural and Social Transformation. At the end of this, I'll be saying some farewell and sharing some reflections and remarks, but I do not want to take away more time from our speaker, who, as I mentioned, is Professor Katharina Gerstenberger, who is a professor of German in the Department of World Languages and Cultures at the University of Utah. From 2012 to 2018, she served as chair of that department, and she most recently, and this is how we had an opportunity to work together, most recently was interim director of Environmental Humanities graduate program here in the college. She's the author of Truth to Tell, German Women's Autobiographies and the Turn of the Century Culture, Writing the New Berlin, the German Capital in Post-Wall Literature. She also co-edits the German Literature in a New Century, Trends, Traditions, Transformations, and Transitions, After the Berlin Wall, Germany and Beyond, and perhaps my favorite, which I'm really interested in reading and have not yet read, Catastrophe and Catharsis, Perspectives on Disaster and Redemption in German Culture and Beyond. And the project she's going to talk to you about today sounds and echoes of concerns about disaster. Her articles have appeared in the on topics of 20th and 21st century German literature, such as German Quarterly, German Politics and Society. She's appeared in several anthologies, including German Literature and the Age of Globalization, Spatial Turns, Place, Space, Mobility in German Literary and Visual Culture, Generational Shifts in Contemporary German Culture, and in German Eco-Criticism and the Anthropocene. She's a professor also of Environmental Humanities, as well as being in World Languages and Literatures, and she is currently the editor of German Studies Review. She'll be speaking to us today about an interesting project that's part of a book titled Disturbed Places in Troubled Times. With that, please join me in welcoming Professor Katharina Gerstenberger and thanking you. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all. Can you hear me okay on Zoom? I guess. Yes. Okay. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Just making sure. So, of course, you've heard this before, but you've not heard me say this. I want to start out by thanking the Tanner Humanities Center and the people who made all of this possible. So Beth and Susan and Katie, so that's the technology behind the screen. Thank you all for facilitating this. Jeremy, obviously, for running our conversations, and Erica, who sort of pulls it all together for us. And of course, also my fellow fellows. I mean, this has been a fantastic year, really, last semester on the fellowship, and this semester sort of with the conversations we had. It was very, very productive. It's a real privilege to be part of this group, and very grateful. And I think, as Jim said last time, I can only encourage you to apply, get a Tanner, and have as good a time as we had here. So I'm going to share my screen. All right. And what else was I supposed to do? Right.
those?
We can see it on the Zoom.
You can see it fine. You can see
we're
it fine.
good.
Okay.
Thanks.
Then I think this should be okay then. So as Erica just said, I'm going to talk about my book in progress, Disturbed Places in Troubled Times, Bikini, Chernobyl, Fukushima. What these places have in common is that they're all sites devastated by nuclear tests, nuclear accidents. So this is what brings this together. I've picked these places because I think they sort of signify what it means living in a drastically altered world and drastically altered by a human impact on this planet. So that's what brings this together. What I'm interested in is artistic representations. So in all of these three cases, artists have gone to these places and they've either written books about it, made feature films, made documentary films, photography, art installations. So there is, the more I research this, the more stuff I tend to find. So there's a large corpus of artistic material out there that I've collected, I'm still collecting, and I'm in the process of analyzing this. So I approach these places through art. What these artists do is a number of different things. I mean, they sort of think through the connections between the local and the global, because I mean, these accidents or tests have local implications, but of course, fallout drifts around this entire globe. They have global implications as well. It's very hard, I think, for us to imagine this, and what these writers, filmmakers, artists do in part is sort of help us find language, visual language, verbal language, concepts, ideas, how to imagine this. This is, I think, what's fascinating about this. Another topic that sort of goes through is experiences of loss. Obviously, there's human life, there's loss of animal life, landscapes destroyed, etc. On the other hand, there is the idea and the trope of life goes on after all. You probably know, I mean, sort of the return of nature in the case of Chernobyl, or in other places as well, or people living in the exclusion zone. So how do you come to terms with these tensions here? What I will, so this is the big project. So what I will talk about today is the first aspect of this, Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands. And this section consists, like the other ones as well, of 3 chapters. What I'm going to present to you today is sort of the middle chapter here. I start out in the 1950s, looking at narratives when people sort of come to terms with, certainly the German literature that I looked at, they describe as the new death. So, because I mean, this is new, right? And so what people are trying to do is find language for it and sort of express profound disturbance as well. The final chapter will be about, or is about.
Sorry for the disturbance, but there is an issue with the slides.
They can't see them?
It froze, like it
Yeah, it wasn't advancing.
started, and it froze, and we got lost. We got scared.
Sorry about that.
Okay, that's an improvement on this end, but it's still in presentation mode, or it's in a not in slideshow mode.
Yes, also we can see that setting.
Stop! No. I'm gonna get it.
You are going to get it. I have absolute faith this is going to work.
That's great.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, so all I need to do is hit this button. That's
To move forward.
yeah.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Okay. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Thank you. I told you Katie is one who fixes things around. Yeah, so thank you so much. Anyway, so the final Bikini Atoll chapter is contemporary representations that sort of engage in a very different way with these places. So, I think what I will do first is sort of orient ourselves a little bit, because I'm not sure that everybody sort of recalls where the Marshall Islands are and what happened there. So I will spend a little bit of time sort of giving you some context, but the reason I'm doing this, what I want to get at ultimately is three, hope I have enough time, documentary films that address this issue. So this is where I'm going with it. So the Marshall Islands are, here you have a map. So you can see they're kind of between Hawaii and Australia. They're just barely north of the equator. So that's where they are. And you think they're sort of very remote and far away, but for the US, actually, they have pretty important strategic importance as sort of a stopover between here and the US and Asia, basically. So, and that's part of the narrative as well. So this is where they are, halfway between Hawaii, Australia, just north of the equator. So now zooming in a little bit, sort of a look at the Marshall Islands. So you can see the size sort of, I obviously found this somewhere what people say, so we can kind of imagine it. The size of the country is the size of Mexico, but the land mass is about 70 square miles. So obviously water plays a huge role in this environment and for the people who live there. I've sort of put in some arrows here. So you can see here on the western side, Bikini is where a lot of these tests took place. So they're sort of at the outskirts even of the Marshall Islands, which I think is why this place was picked. So I will talk about Bikini, then a little to the west is Enewetak. I don't have an arrow here, but that's another island where even more tests were conducted. So these places are very important here. Another place, that's the handmade arrow here, is Rongelap. I will talk about that. That is an island where they did not conduct tests, but where after a particular test, and I'll get to this, radioactive fallout sort of drifted towards this, exposed people to radioactivity, injured them, and they are sort of part of the narrative. So Rongelap will play an important role in my story here. And then the final place I want to point out is here in the middle, Kwajalein Atoll. That is the place, the biggest landmass, I think you can see, that is the place where the United States to this day has a very important Air Force base. So just sort of to orient ourselves just a little bit in the, and I can come back to this map if need be, in the geography of the place. So what I want to talk about next is the sort of the history of the nuclear tests in the Marshall Islands. Again, that's sort of the backdrop for, can I move this? Okay, that might be better. So sort of the backdrop for my story here. So I think I already said in between 1946 and 1958, the US conducted 67 nuclear tests in the Marshall Islands on Bikini and Enewetak. And I had a question sort of how much radiation was released again. It's hard to imagine, but I found in a very recent article about this, it's the equivalent of 7,000 Hiroshima bombs. I'm not sure I can, that really helps me understand this, but any better, but obviously it's a huge amount of radiation. I think we can agree on that. Just very briefly here, the image I have, that is from 1946, the summer, that's the so-called Baker shot. That was an underground explosion, underwater, I should say, explosion. In the foreground, you can see Bikini Atoll. In the background, the mushroom cloud, right? You can sort of see why it's called that. These little black dots you see in the background, that's the so-called target fleet, because what the US had done is they assembled 90 plus military ships in the lagoon of Bikini Atoll. They wanted to see what happens if you nuke battleships. And And then they had American ships, but also Japanese and Germans, because I mean, these obviously are the people they had just defeated. So they used some of those ships there as well. And what does happen is some of them sank, actually. People were kind of disappointed, not enough of them sank, but they were all absolutely irradiated and nobody really could have survived this. So that was the outcome here. So this is sort of an iconic image. If you sort of look into this, you'll find this time and again. A few other things that are important here. March 1st, 1954, we have the Bravo shot. That's the first deliverable hydrogen bomb that was detonated on Bikini Atoll. And what happened as a result of this, about 250 Marshallese were exposed on Rongelap Island. I just showed you where this is on the map. So the wind drifted to the east where it should not have gone, but it just did. What happened to the people there? They experienced skin burns, hair loss, and I'll get to this because there's documentation of that. So those were sort of the immediate consequences. Long-term consequences were cancers, especially of thyroid and leukemia. Stillbirths, you have these stories about the jellyfish baby, these babies born without any bones formed, and obviously they were not viable, and birth defects. So pretty serious consequences for the people there. As a result, then what also happened is that US doctors came in and examined and treated victims over decades. That's part of the story. They went to the Marshall Islands, examined them, but also flew them out to the United States for treatment. In 1957, so what is that? 3 years after Castle Bravo, the hydrogen explosion that exposed these people, the US resettles the Rongelap piece onto this island. They said it's safe. They also admitted, yes, there's still radiation there, but it's safe. So they repatriated these people in 1957 to very horrible effects. Obviously, it was not safe. In 1984, the Greenpeace ship Rainbow Warrior evacuates people from Rongelap at their own request, basically, because they sort of had a high incidence of cancer, birth defects, etc. So they said this is just not safe. The US would not do it. The Marshallese government didn't have the funds either. So Greenpeace comes in and evacuates these people. So Rongelap is abandoned to this day. From what I know, Bikini Atoll is uninhabitable to this day because you can visit. I guess that's safe, but you couldn't eat any of the produce, coconuts, etc. produced there because it's still contaminated. And many Marshallese to this day are internally displaced within the Marshall Islands. So this is obviously very brief, but this kind of gives you an idea as to what happened there. Then also maybe just a tiny bit more about the Marshall Islands and why the US picked this and what this place and what the connection might be. So the Marshall Islands have been inhabited for about the last 3,000 years. That seems to be the agreement. They were first discovered in quotation marks by the Spanish in the 16th century. They're named after a British sea captain named John Marshall, so the name stuck for some reason. Then in the 19th century, which I have to say I did not know until I started this research, this place was a German colony, so of all things and places. So Germany lost all of its colonies during World War I. You probably know this. Then the Japanese took over, and obviously the US defeated Japan in World War II, also the nuclear attack, and the Americans take over from the Japanese in 1945. So this is sort of where the relationship between the US and the Marshall Islands come from. Between 47 and 86, the Marshall Islands are US trust territory. The UN had sort of placed these islands into the trust of the United States, sort of as administrators. 1986, the RMI, Republic of the Marshall Islands, becomes independent. There's sort of a long history of negotiations that leads up to that, but that's the outcome. And kind of important for our story here is that since 86, the relationship between the Marshall Islands and the US is governed by a compact of free association, which allows the US to retain Kwajalein Atoll. I just pointed this out as an Air Force base, and the current contracts allow for occupation of this island until 2066. So they're going to be around for a while. In return, the Marshall Islands receive financial aids. You probably noticed when we had sort of COVID vaccination numbers in the newspaper, the Marshall Islands and other places were mentioned. I think that's the reason that the US sort of sent vaccines there. And the Marshall Islanders are allowed to settle in the US. I mean, there's a large community, for instance, in Arkansas. So I have some pictures here. So the top picture is Kwajalein Atoll. I think it's kind of a runway type thing. What you see here, sort of this American installation. And what you have on the bottom here is Runit Dome, if I pronounce this correctly. This is on Enewetak Atoll. That is a site where in the 1970s, the Americans sort of tried to do cleanup work, and they shoveled a lot of nuclear waste into this. This was a bomb crater, so they put it in there, put some concrete on top. This thing is in the news every once in a while, even today, because I think it was not the best construction job in the first place. It leaks, and it's very poorly monitored, is my understanding. With sea level rise, which is one of the biggest issues in the Marshall Islands these days, sooner or later, this is probably going to be flooded and it's going to come home to affect the global communities. That's sort of the global local tension here. So this sort of shows you just a little bit. Should also mention that the Marshallese filed numerous lawsuits in US courts for compensation. I think they had to end this in '86. It's my understanding independent countries can't file lawsuits against each other. But just to let you know, these people actually were quite active in trying to fight the consequences, the nuclear legacies, and what was done with them. They were victims, obviously, but not entirely passive in all of this. So this is sort of the context as far as the Marshall Islands are concerned, sort of briefly outlined. And sort of one more thing before we can then finally get to the films, but I think this is important. These films that I'm moving towards are from the 1980s. And of course, the 1980s are sort of an important moment in the fight against both the use of nuclear energy and the use of nuclear weapons. Sort of different countries have different approaches to this. I think sort of weapons and energy sort of particularly closely linked up in the German public imagination, but the 1980s are sort of a decade of accidents, protests, but also government decisions actually to push both nuclear energy and nuclear weapons. So just super quickly here, 1979, we have 3 Mile Island here in the US in Pennsylvania. Also at the very end of '79, we have the NATO double track decision, which meant that sort of medium-range missiles and warheads were stationed in Europe, obviously pointing in the direction of the Soviet Union. That was the first step in the double track. So that was step number 1. We're going to put more arms here. Number 2 was from a decision, from a position of strength. We are going to then negotiate. And so in my own history, I was still in Germany at the time. Those were the demonstrations I attended, certainly, and have recollections of that. So 1983, you have Ronald Reagan's Star Wars SDI initiative. The idea here was that you could neutralize nuclear missiles being shot from the other side, the Soviet Union, obviously in space. That's why they came up with Star Wars. And Kwajalein Atoll actually played a pretty important role in the testing of this technology. And then, of course, in '86, you have the Chernobyl reactor accident. So there's a lot going on in terms of nuclear stuff. You have the big demonstration. I guess the biggest ever was in New York, 1 million people, but you also have them in Japan and in West Germany. My pictures here, Brockdorf, you don't need to know German, I think, to understand that. Brockdorf, unser Chernobyl. Brockdorf is a nuclear power plant in Germany. Unser Chernobyl, obviously, this is 1986 in reaction to the Chernobyl reactor accident. So you have big demonstrations there. The picture here on the bottom, I just mentioned the Rainbow Warrior, right? That Greenpeace ship that that evacuated the people from Rongelap in '84 from their contaminated island. So in '85, that is that same ship here. It is sunk in Auckland, New Zealand. You can sort of still see nuclear-free Pacific here on the boat. This was done, I think that's pretty clear, by the French Secret Service. This ship was out en route to Mururoa Atoll, where in French Polynesia, where the French conducted nuclear tests until 1996. So much longer than the Americans. And I guess they weren't happy with the protests about to happen. So they figured, let's sink this thing and put an end to this. Of course, it did not put an end to this. One person got killed. But again, sort of just briefly, I hope sort of to give you a little bit of an idea that the 1980s are sort of an important context for people being interested in the use of nuclear power, nuclear weapons, and what sort of as the context within which these films were made. So once again, what I'm interested in after all of this is films from this time period, but I think we sort of need a little bit of context here to understand that. So I have 3 films that I found and want to talk about. So the first one is by Dennis O'Rourke. He was an Australian, he's no longer alive, an Australian filmmaker. O'Rourke has done extensive work as a documentary filmmaker in Asia and in the Pacific Islands. And I mean, I showed you the map, so from Australia, you're kind of a bit closer to this, so that was his interest. He was quite controversial. He, for instance, made a film titled The Good Woman of Bangkok, in which he chronicled his relationship with a Thai sex worker. So he did not shy away from controversial topics. So I think it's kind of interesting to look at this poster here, because it sort of brings together a bunch of the narrative elements that I'm interested in. So half-life obviously sort of refers to the sort of the decay period of nuclear isotopes, but of course also to what it did to the people who lived in these islands. So you have the mushroom cloud here in the background, then prominently displayed the US flag. So in many of these films, it's really about US impact on these communities. And then interestingly, you have actually recognized this an image, a picture by the French painter Paul Gauguin, sort of natives in, I think he painted in French Polynesia and Tahiti. But anyway, sort of people sitting half naked, more than half naked, in sort of a paradisical, idyllic type of setting. So this, in a sense, sort of encapsulates nicely actually some of the narrative and visual elements that we find in these films. So this is the first one. The second one is, I was very pleased when I found this, that there's actually a German film on this topic. So Oliver Helbrich was born in 1961. You can see him here in the picture. He's still alive. He's done a number of things, including a documentary about a leper colony in Nepal. So he certainly doesn't shy away from extreme environments, let's say. So the film is titled Bikini Mon Amour, obviously a play on Alain Resnais's 1959 film, Hiroshima Mon Amour. And as I'm doing this research, I mean, there's Bikini Mon Amour, there's Chernobyl Mon Amour, there's Fukushima Mon Amour, and after the next accident, I hope will not happen, but just might, there'll be another Mon Amour, right? So this is, of course, also the film, actually, this one does not do an awful lot except borrow the title with the Resnais film, but the title obviously sort of resonates with people, and it if nothing else, sort of it expresses affection and connection with a place, I would say. Sort of his caption here, macht euch die Erde untertan. I have to read this. It's from the Bible, and it's the Bible for me is still in German. It means have dominion upon the earth. So that's the famous quote, obviously, and what he shows here is, well, this is what happens if you have dominion upon the earth, right? So that's the next film. And then the final film, and that's sort of the most Famous one certainly is Robert Stone. I think he was British born, but sort of his career is mainly in the United States. It's called Radio Bikini from 1988. Again, you have the palm trees here, and then sort of these waves going out. I think that could be, well, radio waves, obviously, because it actually talks about a radio station on Bikini Atoll, but of course also sort of nuclear radioactivity radiating out. So these are the three films that I want to talk about. As I said, this is the most famous one. It was nominated for an Oscar in the documentary film category. During that year, another film, it's called Hellfire, A Journey from Hiroshima, about sort of wall murals in Hiroshima, was also nominated. I don't think either of them won, but again, sort of to support my argument here, 1980s, things nuclear were on people's minds, because obviously the Oscars do have their political context. This film also was nominated for a grand jury prize here at our very own Sundance Film Festival. So it was shown here in Utah as well. So what these three films have in common, which I think is interesting and part of my narrative here, is that they all use, to differing degree, but they all use archival footage. So in that sense, not all documentary films use archival footage, but these three films here have this in common, which I think is an interesting feature of these films. And the reason there is so much footage to go back to that, especially in 1946, but also beyond, the US Army was sort of joint Army Navy. They actually filmed these events in major ways. I mean, they for various reasons. I mean, they wanted obviously these films for sort of scientific purposes, so that you could sort of do an autopsy of these shots, explosions. I mean, to this day, you'll see bunkers on places like Bikini and Inuitak that were built to shield the house cameras and shield them from the radiation. But obviously, this was directed at the address of the Soviet Union. Look what we are capable of. But also mostly that's the argument I found at sort of an internal US-American audience to convince people that these nuclear tests actually were necessary and useful. Because I mean, this was immediately after the end of World War II. Not everybody in the United States was convinced that this was really what this country needed to be doing. So one of the, as I read up on this, sort of one of the researchers who worked on this sort of describes the tests on Bikini, Operation Crossroads, is the media event of the year. So this was highly publicized. What they did with this film footage is they sort of put it together into newsreels, and that stuff was then shown in cinemas in the United States to reach a domestic audience, really. And just sort of quickly, the images that I have here, this is sort of one of the primal scenes. If you look at these films and work on this topic, there's no way around this particular scene. And what we see here on the top is Commodore Ben Wyatt. That's the guy in the army outfit to the left, sitting on a log or something. So he was the military commander of the Marshall Islands. So he had been asked to travel to Bikini and to ask the local inhabitants of this island whether they would be willing to leave their island and allow the United States to conduct these tests. And I think the arguments I sort of found is that they were a little worried that people might say, well, what about the people who live in Bikini Atoll? So this is sort of trying to get in ahead of the controversy, saying, well, we went there, we asked them nicely, and they said yes, they were going to leave. So this is what this scene is about, as I said, this sort of shows up in every single one of the documentaries that I've looked at. Sort of what's interesting about this, and I will come back to this, I'm sort of preparing the ground here a little bit, is what you see. I'm sort of trying to capture this in the image below, which ultimately shows the same scene, but you see obviously this is surrounded by camera men. So this was not, as I guess American newsreel consumers in the movie theaters were supposed to think, this was a sort of a spontaneous scene filmed once spontaneously, and here we have the reality of what's happening. What actually happened is they had to film this many times, several times, and all these outtakes are in the archives here in order to get it right. And I think sort of one of the key issues here was what Ben Wyatt says here in order to convince the natives to leave, is that all of this, and that's sort of a quote that comes up time and again, that all of this is for the good of mankind. And sort of as he rehearses this, there's sort of various pronunciations of this. So that it's for the good of mankind. It's for the good of mankind. So he sort of tries it out, sort of what would have the best effect. And the filmmakers then sort of use this in order to show, well, this was not a spontaneously filmed scene, but actually something that was staged and rehearsed to some degree. So I think what sort of brought people's attention to what brought the existence of, I think, a huge amount of archival material pertaining to the nuclear tests, what brought this to people's attention to some degree is, I have it here as a film from 1982, The Atomic Cafe. Some of you might have heard of the title or be familiar with this. The Atomic Cafe is a compilation film that uses archival footage only, exclusively. It sort of starts with the nuclear bomb tests on Bikini, but then also has a lot of these duck and cover type films from the 1950s that again were sort of used to show the American public, sure, if your house is neat and tidy and you listen to what dad tells you, it's incredibly patriarchal, that stuff, then you can survive, right? So what this film does obviously is draw attention to it, but also sort of expose it as propaganda. And I read somewhere that they screened over 10,000 films to put this thing together, which is less than an hour. So obviously they picked and chose, but they also had a huge amount of material to pick and choose from. So these documentaries rely on archival footage to sort of reconstruct events for the audience. Sort of a little bit what I'm trying to do here is to, because I mean, they needed to remind people to tell the story, so they use it for that purpose, but also to reveal its status as propaganda by sort of using it, the material, against its original intent. And I sort of am trying to demonstrate this a little bit here with it's sort of a primal scene for the good of mankind, please leave. And of course they have no choice but to say, sure, we're going to leave. So with this, so the first film is the Australian one, Half-Life. I sort of want to analyze a little bit of how this film works and how it's put together. So what Dennis O'Rourke wants to show, sort of the message clearly is, he wants to show that radiation exposure was deliberate, that people were deliberately not evacuated from Rongelap Island, and that the victims were used for medical experiments. I mean, that is his overarching argument that he wants to make. For that, he focuses on Castle Bravo, first hydrogen explosion, and the fate of these people. I told you they were exposed, then not evacuated for more than 50 hours, then finally evacuated, and then in 1957 sort of returned to the island. So the film sort of tells us this, story, and it uses original footage, talked about that a little bit, and interviews. So you have this original footage to, again, tell the story, but also sort of as sort of a foil against which then these interviews work and sort of tell a different story, a counter narrative. I think that's sort of the structure. The film does not use voiceover, just intertitles. So I think sort of in order not to distract from the power of the visual images, if you will. And So it does this, the film has two sets of interlocutors. So one of them is victims from Rongelap Island. And here the lower picture of this woman sitting here, that's sort of a typical image that you'll find time and again in these films, sort of people sort of in a shot in semi-close up, sort of faces clearly showing harm, despair, etc., as these people are asked to tell the story. So what happened back then in 1954, exposure, and what happened afterwards, what consequences did you face? And I think this woman here tells a story how she had sort of gave birth to jellyfish baby, sort of unviable baby. So it's definitely stories of suffering and harm. What this film also does is it leaves these victims unnamed, which I think is somewhat problematic. The other set of interlocutors are US servicemen who were also exposed on an uninhabited island. They were sort of weathermen and sort of had some tasks there. They are actually named in the films. They sort of have their weather maps and their equipment there, sort of to make the same argument. Yes, we were exposed. The US people in charge should have known that the wind was going to shift. So this is sort of part of the argument here. Could they have known that the wind was going to shift in the wrong direction towards this island? Should they have called off the shot? The footage from the original footage from the film, this is what I have above here. So to the left, that is sort of an Army radio broadcaster specialist who tells, I think this is sort of a propaganda film, if you know, if you wish, who tells a US audience, well, the Pacific is really, really big and it's really, really difficult to predict wind and weather patterns. So he sort of makes a plea saying, well, yes, everybody acknowledges people did get exposed, but there was no way we could have known that this was going to happen. So this footage here, it's sort of, well, we still have obviously tons of talking heads. This is sort of the 1950s version of talking heads. Sort of he makes this argument, well, it's very complicated out there, weather predictions in the Pacific. We clearly did our best, but of course we don't control this. So this is sort of original footage, and then you have these US weathermen. I don't have a picture of them here, sort of say, well, they certainly could have known. So it's narrative, it's official narrative that's out there, and counter narrative. I think sort of the most interesting and perhaps also problematic footage is what I have here to the left. So this is also 1954, shot by US medical personnel or people sort of filming US doctors who were flown in immediately after it had become clear that people had been exposed, and they would sort of put victims in front of the camera and sort of point to their wounds, expose sort of your hair loss in this image, or skin lesion, sort of skin burns. Obviously, if you look at this sort of, you have it's just a still from that film, sort of brown skinned child and a very white looking hand. Obviously, it reflects the racial hierarchies involved here in this footage. Obviously, there was also no consent on the part of these people to be filmed in this way or treated by US doctors, etc. So the film sort of draws attention to the fact that people had been exposed, which also nobody denies, but was it deliberate or not? I mean, that's sort of the issue that the United States denies to this day. So what I would say, what this first thing does here is it draws attention to the plight of the Marshallese. And from what I know, it's really sort of the first work of art of any kind that does this. Filmmaker clearly went there, interviewed people. I think it makes a very strong case for US culpability. It's quite convincing the way it's presented here. But I think it also sort of reinforces national and ethnic hierarchies by, for instance, not giving the Marshallese interview partners names, which they do have, obviously. And I think sort of the way it uses this original footage here is a bit problematic too. Sort of could have maybe done a little bit more to unpack what's in these images. So this is the second film. This is Hiroshima Mon Amour by the German filmmaker. So this is again, same topic, but sort of different approach here. What he does is he sort of contextualizes the nuclear tests in the history of the Marshall Islands. He talks about the colonial history. He's also much more interested than the Australian film in the contemporary situation. So the picture here on the upper left is a contemporary image, I mean, 1987, obviously, from the Marshall Islands, sort of showing the viewer, well, this is what it looks like now. And this is, I think, eBay Island, sort of very small, crowded island close to Kwajalein. I guess often gets referred to as the slum of the Pacific. The film also uses this term, sort of talking about internal displacement. So it sort of continues the history, has a bigger, has a sort of a bigger historical context. The thing to the picture to the right here is Runit Dome on Enewetak that I sort of showed in the beginning. He has some footage here showing how this thing was constructed. So again, is from the 1970s. So again, he sort of goes beyond the actual events, but is really interested also in the consequences here. The picture on the bottom here, again, and that's, I think, obviously one of the things I'm interested in is sort of the depiction of Marshallese in these images, but in these films, both sort of contemporary images and historical image. So this is a historical shot from, I think, the 1960s. At some point, as US doctors were treating people, but also, of course, sort of using them, I think there's no question about it, for medical studies, sort of looking at long-term consequences. They were sort of repeatedly flown into the United States and tested there. Sort of one of the tropes that you find throughout these sort of the original footage, obviously, is, and I think that really goes back to the 19th century, even further down, further back into history, is this argument, well, these are sort of happy people. This comes up time and again. And this image here, I chose this, of course, also demonstrate, I'm sure these two young men were laughing at the time. I don't think they were told to laugh, but obviously, I mean, this sort of included, yes, these people were happy, they were laughing, they had a great time. I mean, I think the young man on the scales he was being measured had thyroid cancer at the time. Still, he's a very happy person. I think that's sort of the message that I think the viewer is supposed to get, and the film sort of shows this trope. The film then sort of contextualizes it again, and this was in the 1960s when Nikos Anjin is his name, even though the film doesn't say that either, had thyroid cancer and was treated in the United States. In 1972, he dies of leukemia in the United States. His coffin is being sent back to the Marshall Islands, and there's footage of his burial there. So this whole story does not have a happy outcome, but this film sort of works with these tropes to sort of expose them to some degree. So I think what this film does, I think the strength is clearly sort of the larger context. It also, and I think here gets a little problematic maybe, it sort of works with the idea of a betrayed Eden, sort of suggesting that these remote places ultimately really should have stayed remote and sort of could have remained the paradises that they once were. It's mourning a loss, which I think is definitely something one can sort of identify, and I think it's a good message to give. But on the other hand, what it fails to do is sort of, to some degree, sort of unpack the idea that obviously sort of mourning for a betrayed Eden, for something that on some level never was, also is a somewhat problematic narrative. But I mean, again, these are, I think, ultimately very valuable films. So final one here, Radio Bikini, is kind of interesting because Bikini Atoll really did have a radio station. So it's not just the filmmaker who made this up, but sort of during Operation Crossroads, summer of 1946, they really broadcast live from Bikini, which again sort of goes back to the idea media event of the year. I mean, they really made sure that this was a media event here. And what you see in this image here, sort of there's the microphone, obviously, to the right from my perspective. This is the broadcaster. To the left is a young man. He's only 18. He tells us, doesn't have terribly much to say, but what is he going to say? Poor kid. But it sort of shows, I mean, this is sort of American use of Bikini Atoll as they prepare for the tests. And then this film sort of is interspersed with quite a bit of footage like the image down here, people back home, because I mean, you broadcast something out into the world, you need somebody to actually listen to this. So the film sort of shows us how this is received back home. I guess these are people who are sort of listening to a baseball game and then it's interrupted. And we're now getting ready for the first shot at Bikini Atoll. There are other sort of people, sort of families, women doing some sewing and listening to the radio. I will say it reminds me a little bit of 1930s footage from Germany, people listening at the Volksempfänger, the people's radio, people's receiver, listening to the Führer. I think there's sort of certain resonances in these images here. So what this film does, this is not interested in intentional exposure to radiation. This film really wants to show these propaganda reels, images, footage shot in the 1940s here in this case. This was really propaganda footage. I mean, that's the argument this film wants to make. And it sort of shows a somewhat completer, more complete image of what happened in the 1940s with the use of nuclear weapons. There are, in this one, there are references to Hiroshima and also a reference to protest against the nuclear test. So it contextualizes it from that point of view. I have sort of two super brief quotes here. The majority of people working on nuclear news reels and then Radio Bikini sort of give the film a lot of credit. Radio Bikini allows us to witness the making of propaganda. This is one of the scholars who thinks this is successful. Others say, well, the audience might resent the blatant attempts to manipulate it. So people have sort of somewhat divided opinions on this, but what it wants to show is definitely this was propaganda. So just, I'm sort of wrapping up here, just sort of to show you again a little bit sort of how this film makes the point that what we were presented in the 1940s and 50s was actually propaganda. So there are two interview partners, again, who sort of provide the counter narrative here. The first one is Kylon Bauno, sort of an exiled Bikinian. Today was young adult, I guess, when this happened. And today, an old man. So he testifies to the betrayal of his community. And he sort of goes back, was asked to go back to the primal scene here. You're now familiar with this here, Commodore Wyatt, the translator next to him, asking the Bikinians, are you ready to leave for the good of mankind? So Bauno sort of recalls this primal scene. And the way the film works is sort of, we see the black and white 1946 footage in the background here without voice, so it's muted. And then you have Bauno sort of first talking about it, and then you see him in the picture and he says, well, we had no idea what we were asked to do. We left with great sadness. So none of the happy people sort of saying, yeah, sure, this is fine. We can easily go to a different location. So we left with great sadness. We had no idea what they were really talking about here. And then he also says, and we had no idea, we didn't understand why the Americans had to do these things so many times, which at first you don't even understand, but then sort of the film sort of uses these outtakes and sort of shows, okay, good of mankind, good of mankind. So it shows sort of that this was rehearsed, and it's also very clear that the inhabitants of the Bikini Atoll were just sort of used as extras in this film, and certainly not as protagonists. And yeah, sort of people who had a real role to play in any of this, except sort of just sit there and accept the message. So it sort of cuts back and forth between archival footage and contemporary footage and interviews to make its argument. And then there's another interview partner in this film. So it's Kylon Bauno and then John Smitherman, a US serviceman. And here the narrative is people said, US servicemen, you want to be safe. We're going to take care of you. Radiation is not going to hurt you at all. Don't you worry one bit. So the witness here is Smitherman, who is dying of cancer. You find this out at the end of the video, sort of the film. Towards the film, we only see sort of his sort of semi close up his face, but this is the final scene with him. The camera sort of draws back and shows that you can sort of see this too well here, but he's a double amputee. He sort of lost his legs, which presumably had to be amputated because of the radiation he received. And you can see his left hand is sort of very enlarged. So he is clearly a victim of radiation, but also that's the point here of US deception. And the way here, again, it sort of goes back and forth. There's a lot of footage showing US servicemen on the target fleet. I mentioned this in the very beginning, on these ships that were nuked and irradiated. And they are sort of shown walking there, working there without much protective clothing. And sort of Smitherman sort of tells, yes, and we were told to enter the ship 2 hours after the detonation, just in our t-shirts. And then you see sort of footage of people. You kind of think almost it's Smitherman himself. It's sort of, these things are sort of very closely cued to one another, that he sort of narrates about what we see in this footage. Clearly, I mean, here, this is an image of people exercising on deck, obviously with no protective gear at all. So again, sort of this is how original footage is used here, spliced together with his narrative, and then the camera reveals his condition only in the very final scene, that he is a victim, that clearly he was not saved. He's been deceived together with many others. And that's the outcome. And then the closing credit says that he died shortly thereafter. So this is, obviously one could say a lot more, but I'm going to conclude this now here. So these are the films I wanted to talk about. And sort of wrapping it up, I think it's very clear that these are products of the 1980s. I think this context is quite important here, with an international focus on nuclear weapons and demonstrations. They all had their audience. I mean, none of them made it really big, but they all had their audience. They all won prizes of various kinds. So they certainly had some success. I think the main target here really is the US government. I think that's, if I understand this correctly, is also the case with these 1980s demonstrations and protests. I mean, the Germans, of course, also protest against the German government sort of putting up nuclear power plants and allowing the US to station medium-range missiles on German soil. But ultimately, I think, and this is even sort of my own memory, ultimately we were out there demonstrating against the US government. And I think that's what you see here, in particular in Robert Stone's film, the Radio Bikini film. And I think that's sort of from the US perspective. The other two, the Australian and the German filmmaker, they sort of take a slightly broader perspective. But I think ultimately the culprit here is, the target is the US government, as the institution that deceived the Bikinians, but also the public at the time, and 1980s. So they deceived you in the 1940s and 50s. Don't believe them now. I think that's kind of the message here, basically. I think by using, I'd like to discuss this with people if you're so inclined, by using a lot of original footage with from the Marshall Islands, and using it against the original intent, of course, I mean, that's what they're doing. I think on some level, they also remain tied to the 1950s imagery by sort of repeating these. I think they sort of remain in this context to some degree, and can sort of quite and fully detach themselves from the original narrative that, of course, they're now trying to deconstruct. I think it's important to note that the filmmakers, I think, really are among the first artists to give the Marshallese a voice and to represent them. I think this is, and their islands, the places, that is sort of one of the strengths. And I would say it's the beginning of an engagement with sort of what nuclear colonialism means, sort of the exploitation of faraway places, minority populations, etc., for testing the bombs themselves, but also the medical consequences of this. So I think this is the beginning. I don't think they go terribly far yet, but it's certainly the beginning of this narrative. And if I'm not mistaken, I think also in scholarship, sort of this goes back to the 1980s. So I think it fits together quite nicely. To some degree, they also remain caught in a discourse about a betrayed Eden, sort of saying, well, I mean, it's of course it is horrible that these places were destroyed, right? The question is then sort of how do you represent this? How do you talk about this? I think it's a fantasy that these places should and could have remained untouched, or that they sort of in a sort of pre-modern state, and that of course they wouldn't have their sort of histories, conflicts, etc., of their own. So that obviously does not make it into the films here. So just to end here, sort of the film I would have maybe liked to see, or maybe somebody can still make it, and not sort of to tell these people what films they should have made. I mean, that's never productive, obviously, but sort of having done this kind of work as far as I got with it, I think what would be interesting actually is to have a film that sort of shows the Marshallese victims, but also survivors, activists, etc., sort of much more in their own environment, in their own voices, because a lot of these people which are portrayed here as victims, which of course they are, but they also are activists, leaders of their communities. Several of them sort of took countless trips to Washington, to The Hague, etc., to testify in front of international, national and international courts, sort of to tell this history, sort of put them in a larger context. Many of these old people, of course, are no longer alive. I think that would be a different film, obviously, but I think actually very much well worth making, to give them even more of their own voice and representation, sort of what this meant in their lives. And that's it.
Thank you. Where am I? It's not letting me. Oh boy. Oh, hi. Thank you. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Katarina on the Zoom room and the actual room. As is our custom, those who are willing and able on Zoom are free to now come on camera. And we will field questions first from the Zoom room, and we'll alternate with our live guests in the room. If there is anyone on Zoom? Yes. Oh, I see another one of our fellows. This is Janan Graham-Russell, who's also been wonderful and a pleasure to have with us. Janan.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation, Katarina. I've learned so much. These films, I love documentary films, so I'm definitely going to check these out. A couple of things that really stood out to me. I was thinking about, after our talk on Friday, about other films that came out during the 80s, specifically like Mad Max and The Terminator, who were really thinking about, or really talking about, this idea of nuclear weapons and the damage that they cause. And I remember specifically thinking that they were sort of highlighting how these things are happening to white people. And so I see these documentaries that you've presented as sort of opening up this conversation. It's like these people in the Marshall Islands, they're experiencing this, and this is it's not a fantasy. This is the impact of nuclear weapons. The second thing that comes to mind, you talked a little bit about consent, and I'm really interested in sort of this repurposing of propaganda to tell a different story, particularly in terms of consent and what happens to consent when it is not given initially, but then these films are being reused to tell this other story. Is consent then implied? Or I'm just wondering how you're thinking about consent in terms of these documentaries. Thank you.
Thank you, Janelle. These are great question. Yes, I mean, I sort of have to sort of watch some more of these films, but yes, of course. I mean, they're in these fiction films, it happens to white people, and in in these documentaries. And I think this is sort of one of their strength, definitely. They draw attention. This is actually a real place where this happened, and it did not happen to white people. As I said, so I have a first chapter here where also it's a discourse about white people. I mean, sort of the German sources that I have. I mean, these people are really, and for understandable reasons, these people are really saying, well, what if this were to happen to us, right? I mean, that's sort of their first response. So I think in that respect, they're quite path-breaking, I will say. I think this is great. I mean, this is work in progress, obviously. I think sort of your argument about consent, sort of to reuse this footage. I have to think about this. I think this is a great. Thank you. This is a great observation. I mean, obviously, sort of when these people were originally filmed, there was no consent. And as the Marshallese sort of were fighting against this, and they were, which also sort of gets a little lost in these films, consent was precisely one of the issues. I mean, they would say, yes, we're getting treatment and it's competent, but we're also not being treated with dignity here, etc. So this is sort of a narrative that is there. I think it's sort of this testing sort of doing medical care for Marshallese goes on to this day, but there's consent today. So obviously there's some progress. I need to think about, I think I was sort of trying to get at this, but probably didn't get terribly far. What does it mean to reuse this very problematic footage? I think that's what you're saying. I certainly, I think the films use this more to say, yeah, here, look, this actually did happen. And the Americans filmed this themselves. This is actually proof that contamination exposure happened. I think that's as far as these films go. What does it mean to use this footage in a 1986 contemporary film? I think it remains problematic, certainly, but I need to think about this a little bit more sort of as I revise my narrative here, sort of to tease out some of these implications a bit more, because on some level, I think sort of working, as we discussed on Friday, with sort of nuclear colonialism, I think it sort of fits into this larger context, right? And it's sort of a continuation of that. But this is really helpful. Thank you. Oh, yeah, why don't you please?
Hi, Zoom people. Thank you. That was great. And I'm going to ask you a question that's related to something I said when we had the discussion, because I've kind of glommed onto this idea of propaganda. And so one question about that theme in your analysis of the films is just sort of trying to figure out what makes something a piece of propaganda, and not say just a piece of disinformation or a lie or a cover-up or a conspiracy, I mean, there's sort of conceptual issues, but that's not my main question. I guess I was just curious when you say that in the Radio Bikini film, the sort of the aim of the filmmaker was to show that these newsreels were basically propaganda. I didn't get a sense of what, maybe because we didn't get to see enough of the newsreels, what they were propaganda about exactly. And so like, I'm thinking about when I saw Atomic Cafe, right? And then it's like you're laughing at these newsreels at that point, right? Because they're hilarious and sad hilarious at the same time. And one of the things that I remember was these soldiers, they were given like something that was like a Geiger counter or something. And they were so proud of it because then if they got exposed to too much radiation, they would have this thing that would, indicate to them that they did. And I remember the audience laughing because, well, now they've been exposed. I mean, what good does it do to give them these things, except maybe, to get away quicker? But I mean, they were so ignorant that they thought they were being protected by these things, right? And so that was like almost like a piece of propaganda that was delivered to the military people. But I guess I'm sort of in a roundabout way trying to ask is, like, what was the content of the propaganda? Was it, this was done consensually, this is something the Bikini Islanders wanted, this is something that the US government was doing for mankind, this is something that was in the strategically necessary for the US, this is safe, you know, there's a million things that it could have been propaganda about. So I was just curious about specifics. Thanks.
Thank you. Cindy, I would say all of the above. I mean, what you just listed. I mean, sort of the primal thing is really it's yes, they left voluntarily. They're nomadic people, which is not true, but sort of a famous quote that comes up time and again. So by being moved to a different island, the Yanks added some spice to their lives. I mean, this is sort of one of the voiceovers from the original footage that sort of gets used time and again. So I think it's really sort of to get ahead of the argument, the message, and then the criticism. You displaced these people. So I think that really is the message here. They left voluntarily and they were happy to do it. You see them sort of waving on the ship that transports them away. So I think that's what this is. Yes, it was safe, certainly. I mean, that's it's definitely part of the argument. Of course, sort of as the Cold War heats up, you have more and more arguments saying, well, it's really better. I mean, these are terrible weapons, but I mean, of course, it's so much better if we have them rather than the evil empire on the other side. So that's, of course, part of the discourse as well. So I think it's exactly what you listed. That's what the propaganda is about. I wouldn't call it sort of misinformation. I think sort of that's where the media studies communication people can maybe help me out here. I mean, these are not sort of outright lies about something, right? But it's sort of a presentation of something that's actually happening there, sort of with a very particular point of view that sort of wants to get across a particular message and interpretation of the events that happened there. And safety of US servicemen, of course, is very important, right? Because I mean, these US servicemen came back, and this is not something I've researched extensively, but many of course had also been exposed and came back with cancers, etc., over the long term, right? So, and I mean, the Geiger counters, it's actually this is a very complex issue. I mean, what Geiger counters will do is there are dosimeters. What they will do is they tell you how much radiation you've received. And apparently sort of a human body can actually deal with a certain amount of radiation over a period of time. What these things are, do I have my weekly annual limit? Have I reached it? Do I need to get out here? I mean, I think that's how it works. Or can I go on a little bit longer? I think that's what these measuring devices do. It's exposure over time. So they do something in their defense. But yeah, so.
Okay, there was another question on the Zoom, and I'm unclear. It came through chat if I am to pose the question or if the individual who has the question would like to pose it. Okay, hearing nothing, I will go ahead and ask. This is a question that your colleague, Professor Wesley Sasaki Umura, was interested in. Oh, for later. Okay, but I guess I have it now. Katarina, you talk more about this Chernobyl chapter. For the Chernobyl and Fukushima chapters, is your intent to use documentary film as well? Since those documentaries would have come later than the films about the Marshall Islands, is it that you're saying perhaps something different about the different historical contexts? How is it that you are tying these together? I hope that captures the spirit of the inquiry.
Yes, I mean, that of course is the big question for me, how to tie all of this together. And as I said, so it's artist representations from different time periods and angles. So I started working on the Chernobyl portion of the project and started looking at a film from, I think, 1991 by an Austrian filmmaker who goes to Pripyat, that's this abandoned city, and he also interviews people and sort of in this setting and environment to talk about what happened back then and what the situation is now. It's completely different. I mean, there's clearly not this connection to any original footage. I mean, the only footage we see in this is the interview partners and sort of very long and slow takes on the landscape there. So in sort of storytelling narrative arc, but also use of interview partners. I think the last Sundance thing, I sort of watched a lot of documentaries and then the Q&A. I mean, they really talk about protagonists. So the treatment of protagonists is very different here. These people are sort of get the chance to talk at some length about their experience. So the filmmaker is really hands off. I don't think there are any sort of leading question, but really shows these people in their environment and allows them to talk about their experience. I think in a sort of much less sort of cute fashion than what you have in all of these films. So I think the approach in filmmaking sort of develops quite a bit here and changes over time. I mean, this is what I was sort of thinking about this between discussion on Friday. I think the 1980s really do show us a beginning of this kind of documenting and storytelling that then sort of develops over time. So for Fukushima, I mainly currently have feature films who talk about what happened there. But yeah, so that's sort of what I think I can say for now here.
Okay, thank you. And I was smiling because not only did we work together when you were interim director for environmental humanities, I saw you a ton of times at Sundance Documentaries. We're both junkies.
It's one of my favorite things.
It's one of my favorites too. So this was wonderful to see you examine
right
closely. Okay, that was a comment or a comment, not even a question. Janan coined a new term for us, which I try to use every meeting. I don't see any more hands or chat items on our Zoom room side, so I will kick it back over to Jeremy in the real, the other room, not the real room, we're all real, the live room side.
So you talk about this theme of betrayal of Eden, and I'm thinking about the.
Did you want to come up? Because I think that'd be great, because for the Zoom room, it's very hard to hear.
I'm thinking about your theme of the betrayal of Eden that you talk about in these films about the Marshall Islands, and also thinking about different spaces where nuclear testing and nuclear accidents have happened, such as here in Utah and Nevada. And do you see a theme of attempting to talk about these like Edenic spaces as justification for not doing nuclear testing versus some of these more barren landscapes that might be like, they're fine, but they're not fine, but that, you know, we're ruining these beautiful places and we're not so much concerned about these quote unquote less pretty places.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a very good question, certainly. I think sort of for the Americans to choose the Marshall Islands and Bikini Atoll, I showed you the map, sort of, which is remote in quotation, but even within the Marshall Islands. Of course, the argument was because this is so remote and so far away from things. So we can, and there hardly anybody there. There's sort of this infamous Kissinger quote, I think, Pacific Islands, 90,000 people live there, who cares? That's sort of also one of the things that comes up over and over again. So I think the people who decided to do this, and the Americans are not the only ones. I mean, there's French testing, there's British testing in the Pacific. The argument is these are sort of remote places with very small populations. This is great to do this there. I think sort of the betrayal of Eden, I think that's sort of a term that the environmental, the eco-critic Lawrence Buell came up with, is sort of this idea to look at these places saying, sort of to express loss, a nostalgia for something that never really was on some level, and sort of come to terms that something that once was presumably should still be there is destroyed now. So I think sort of the betrayed Eden is part of the counter narrative that sort of picks up on a different way of thinking and speaking and writing and depicting Pacific islands that sort of goes back to Paul Gauguin, the French painter, and other people who sort of created these places as sort of fantasies in the Western imagination. So you have sort of the fantasy of the untouched island where everybody is naked and happy. And at the same time, of course, you also have sort of the notion of the savages who live there. So it's a number of different things that come together. So the Betrayal of Eden, I would see as part of the counter narrative, to say sort of, look what you have done to places that really still should be pristine. The rest of the world isn't there anymore. At least the Pacific islands should be there. Other than that, I mean, yes, of course, I mean, they always pick presumably empty places, whether it's sort of the test sites in Nevada, etc. We think, well, there's nobody here. We can test here. It's safe. Very few people will be affected. Obviously, then you're surprised how many people are in fact there and impacted by this. I mean, and of course, and it's the testing, it's the uranium mining here in Utah, and all of these narratives and legacies, of course, are still around, and people are trying to come to terms with it. No, so that's still very much with us as it is in the Marshall Islands or Chernobyl or Fukushima. Now, sort of, it's sort of this long-term perspective on the one hand that we deal with, and then sort of what happens locally and how sort of do we bring this together. So time, I think, is an important factor here, but also space, because the radiation never just stays in place, right? It moves around, and sort of people have to find ways of trying to figure out, as I said, I'm looking at literature, art, etc. How do you find language, visual and otherwise, to depict this? Now, something that you can see, that you can smell, etc. I mean, that's sort of another part of the argument. How do you come up with narratives? How do you turn this into stories and pictures? So I think that the betrayed Eden, I mean, that's sort of a problem. It makes sense why people sort of would come up with this idea and sort of adhere to that, but it's ultimately problematic, not just as far as the Pacific Islands are concerned, but any space, basically. So I think sort of one often cited argument here is the beginning of, what's it called? No, I'm pulling a blank here. Anyway, sorry, I'm sort of a famous book from the 1960s about DDT. Silent Spring, yes, thank you. I'm thanking Silent Spring, yes, sorry. Silent Spring, sort of depicting this idyllic American rural little town village that should be there, but it's not because the birds have fallen sign. So that's sort of a prime example of Eden betrayed. This should be Edenic, but it's really not. Silent Spring. Yes, thank you. Yes.
Hello, everyone. I'm interested, as you know, in stories and the ways in which we have a variety of kind of narrative traditions and tropes at our disposal. And so the obvious one, this is just, it kind of reeks of capital R romanticism, right? This critique of progress, the Frankenstein story, the fact that, you know, our vaunted progress, our vaunted knowledge, wisdom, technology will destroy us. And that's what's going on in all the other films that have been referenced. And here, then, it's overlaid with one particular variant of that. I mean, it's that the movie poster you showed is perfect, because the Polynesia is like ground zero before it's ground zero for that story, right? With Gauguin, you know, fleeing and creating these. And I suspect that if you go back and you even like read the journals of John Marshall, after whom these things are named, in the renderings of those people at the time, you're going to get some of those very same tropes, right? That Westerners imagine themselves and come to know themselves in opposition to these imagined others who live somehow in this timeless, harmonious thing. So I love the theme. One thing that just occurred to me, one of the reasons why this is happening there is there's an airfield. And there's an airfield there because the Japanese built an airfield and then the Americans took it, right, in the Second World War. So all of these places, or a lot of these places, which are being rendered in these stories as utterly pristine and timeless, have just 10 years before these tests gone through the most horrific, disruptive, appalling war after a period of a brutal Japanese occupation. Then they're scenes of these enormous battles, and there are tens and even hundreds of thousands of Japanese and American soldiers who are coming through these tiny little places. So I suspect that there's a kind of backstory, a history of who these people are and what they are, that these narratives don't want to touch at all because it wouldn't allow them to fit in the kind of narrative frame you created.
Yes. Thank you. No, that's an excellent point. I think, yes, and obviously there was horrendous fighting towards the end of World War II between the Japanese and the Americans, with very high losses. And they're also an area, of course, there's sort of Marshallese sources that talk about it. I guess they sort of found the Japanese more brutal than the Americans. So they sort of felt on some level that things were going to get better for them. There's certainly stories about that. I think as far as Bikini Atoll is concerned, I mean, as I showed you on the map, it's sort of on the outskirts even of the Marshall Islands. And if Bikini Atoll also had some fighting, I think it had, I forget the numbers, but a very, very small number of Japanese soldiers were stationed there. And I guess they sort of committed suicide before the Americans could get to them. But by and large, and there is footage from this, and that's again sort of mixes, is this now sort of anthropologically important footage, or is it propaganda? I mean, there is footage of, some films make the arguments that even in 1946, Bikini Atoll, sort of at the outskirts of the Marshall Islands, actually sort of still had relatively untouched lifestyles and sort of ways of people sort of to make a living. Of course, it's also true. I mean, yes, I mean, there's a long history here. Of course, I think it was mainly German and other missionaries in the 19th century, of course, who have a huge influence on the culture of these places. I mean, they're sort of heavily, I think, conservative Christian, which of course changed the dress code completely for these people. So church service, I understand to this day, is quite important there. So the culture is anything but pristine and untouched. I mean, there's sort of generations of outsiders sort of coming through, and sort of each of them sort of leaving their different legacy there. Yes, but I mean, you're right, sort of the end of World War II fighting is not something that these documentaries want to go into, but it's definitely, it's part of the story. And sort of in the final chapter here on the Marshall Islands, I sort of get into more Marshallese sources. They are, of course, very much aware of this, and they do talk about this. So yes, but that's a very good point. So I think we're also out of time.
Yes, we are. This flew by, this talk, this whole year. I started the front end introducing and thanking the fellows and the faculty advisory board. I want to close up the back end thanking the people who truly do all of the important work, and that is the Tanner Humanities team staff. Fellows, we will see you again at a closeout, but to Beth James, to Susan Anderson, to Katie Pula, and to Jeremy Rosen, and to our student staff as well, who don't spend as much time with this group, but have been wonderful. They've done so much over the course of changing, challenging times, and I am deeply grateful to the community they were able to help us facilitate creating. So thank you to them. Thank you to our fellows. Thank you to our audiences. We appreciate you.